The defense station shook again, and Katie Morrison pressed her face against the reinforced viewport as another explosion lit up the darkness of space like a dying star. She was 12 years old, and she had seen more death in the past hour than most beings saw in their entire lives. The Kreshnak Empire had come to the Varath defense station with 140 warships and the Allied forces defending. The station had maybe 30 vessels left that could still fire their weapons. It was not a battle anymore. It was an execution. All batteries concentrate fire on Sector 7, Commander. Vorik's voice crackled through the station's communication system, and Katie could hear the exhaustion in the Zentari. Commander's words. The Zentari were supposed to be great warriors, and their species had defended the Allied territories for 300 years, but even they looked small against the Kreshnak fleet. Katie watched as 3 more Allied cruisers tried to form a defensive line near the station's northern dock and the Kreshnak. Ships tore through them like they were made of paper instead of reinforced titanium alloys. Red emergency lights bathed the observation deck in an eerie glow, and the few other civilians who had been watching the battle had long since fled to the evacuation shelters. Katie stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and because watching felt like the only thing she could do to honor what her parents had tried to protect. Captain Daniel Hayes burst onto the observation deck with his uniform torn at the shoulder and burn marks on his left arm. "Katie, you need to get to shelter now," he said, and his voice was firm but kind because he had promised her mother he would keep Katie safe. "They're going to break through the shields in less than 20 minutes," Katie said quietly, and she did not look away from the viewport. Hayes moved beside her and looked out at the carnage, and his jaw tightened. "Yes, they are," he admitted. Katie had lost her parents 3 months ago when the Kreshnak had raided the research outpost on Varath's third moon, and Hayes had been her father's closest friend in the military. He had taken guardianship of her without hesitation, and now he was watching the same enemy that had killed her. Parents come to finish what they started. "The transport routes are cut off," Hayes continued, and he put a hand on her shoulder. "But we have emergency pods that cannot. They move in patterns," Katie interrupted. Hayes blinked and looked down at her. "What?" "The Kreshnak ships, they move in mathematical patterns," Katie said, and she pointed at the enemy fleet. "See how that group of 7 cruisers curves around the station? They're forming a spiral with a ratio of 1 to 6 every 43 seconds. And then the next group mirrors them on the opposite side." Hayes stared at the battle and tried to see what she was describing, but all he could see was chaos and death. "Katie, I know you're scared, but I'm not making it up," she said, and her voice was stronger now. "My mom was studying cognitive adaptation in space environments, and I got sick when I was 8 with neural fever, and after I recovered, I could see patterns that other people couldn't, geometric patterns and movement sequences." Another explosion rocked the station, and the lights flickered. Lieutenant Gregory Park ran onto the observation deck with a datapad in his hands, and his face was pale. "Captain Hayes, Commander Vorik needs you in the command center," Park said, and then he noticed Katie. "What's the kid still doing here?" "Lieutenant, she says the Kreshnak are moving in patterns," Hayes said. Park looked like he wanted to argue, but another massive impact made the deck shudder beneath their feet. "We've lost 70% of our forces," Park said, and his voice was hollow. "The Kreshnak just deployed some kind of new weapon that's draining our shield harmonics, and nothing we do stops it." Katie turned from the viewport and looked at both men. "They're not trying to destroy you quickly," she said. "They're hurting you? Hurting us?" Park asked. "Into kill zones," Katie replied. "Every time your ships move to defend a sector, the Kreshnak push from 3 sides and force you into the areas where their heavy cruisers have the best firing angles, and you keep falling for it because you're thinking about immediate threats instead of the overall pattern." Hayes and Park exchanged glances. "Commander Vorik needs to hear this," Hayes said, and he grabbed Katie's hand. "Come with me." They ran through corridors filled with wounded personnel and emergency crews trying to seal hull breaches. The command center was chaos when they arrived, and Commander Vorik stood at the central tactical display with his forearms gesturing at different screens, while officers from 6 different species shouted reports. The Xanthari commander's scales had turned dark purple, which Katie knew meant extreme stress for his species. "Captain Hayes, I don't have time for—" Vorik began, but Hayes cut him off. "Commander, this child has information about the Kreshnak attack patterns." Vorik's large eyes fixed on Katie, and for a moment she saw something that looked like pity. "Child, I appreciate your concern, but this is a military operation and I cannot." The station rocked violently, and 3 tactical displays went dark. "Sir, we just lost the entire western defensive grid," an officer shouted. "All remaining ships fall back to the station's shadow," Vorik ordered. And then he looked back at Katie. "Young one, you should be in a shelter where it's safe." "There is no safe place on this station," Katie said, and she walked up to the tactical display. "In 8 minutes, the Kreshnak are going to complete their formation, and you'll all be in one big kill zone with no way out." "How could you possibly know that?" Vorik asked, but there was curiosity in his voice now instead of dismissal. Katie pointed at the display where the Kreshnak ships were shown as red dots surrounding the station. "Because they've been forming a geometric cage around you since the battle started, and you keep moving exactly where they want you to move," she said. "My brain sees patterns. It's something that happened after I got sick, and I can see what they're doing, even if I don't understand why." Lieutenant Park pulled up a tactical projection and overlaid the last 30 minutes of ship movements. "Permission to test her theory, sir," Park said. Vorik's scales rippled with indecision, and then he nodded. "The next Kreshnak attack will come from sectors 4 and 9 simultaneously," Katie said, and she studied the display. In exactly 47 seconds, everyone in the command center watched the displays and held their breath. 47 seconds passed. The Kreshnak fleet surged forward from sectors 4 and 9 in perfect coordination. Commander Vorik's scales turned bright yellow, the Xanthari color for shock. "How did you?" "They have a pattern, and patterns can be predicted," Katie said. "But there's something else, something bigger." "What?" Hayes asked. Katie traced her finger along the tactical display and showed how the Kreshnak ships were positioned in an almost perfect sphere around the station with small gaps that appeared and closed in rhythmic intervals. "They're not just attacking," she whispered. "They're building something." Commander Vorik stared at the tactical display, and his forearms hung motionless at his sides as he tried to understand what Katie was showing him. "Building what exactly?" he asked, and his voice carried the weight of a commander who had already lost too many soldiers. Katie's small fingers moved across the holographic projection, and she traced lines between the Kreshnak ships that formed a complex web of intersecting paths. "I don't know what it does," she admitted, "but every ship out there is positioned at a specific distance from every other ship, and when they fire their weapons, the energy doesn't just hit your shields. It passes through to the next ship in the pattern." Lieutenant Park leaned closer, and his eyes widened. "She's right. Look at the energy signatures," he said, and he pulled up sensor data. "Every time they fire, there's a harmonic resonance between their vessels." "A resonance weapon?" Hayes asked. "I've never seen anything like this," Vorik said, and his scales rippled with a mixture of fear and fascination. "The Kreshnak have always relied on overwhelming firepower, not sophisticated energy manipulation." Katie closed her eyes and visualized the pattern in her mind, and it was like watching a 3-dimensional puzzle solve itself. Her mother had called it a gift, but Katie had always thought of it as seeing the world through a different lens than everyone else, one where mathematical relationships were as visible as colors. "The pattern completes in 7 minutes," she said, and opened her eyes. "And whatever happens then, you won't be able to fight it with conventional tactics." An alarm blared through the command center, and an officer at the weapons station shouted a report. "Sir, 3 of our frigates just went dark. Their crews are reporting system failures. Across all decks, not system failures," Katie said quickly. "The resonance is already starting to affect your ships. It's like ripples in water, and your vessels are caught in the interference pattern." Vorik made a decision that went against every military protocol he had learned in 40 years of service. "Lieutenant Park, give this child full access to our tactical systems," he ordered. "Sir?" Park's voice carried surprise. "You heard me," Vorik said, and he looked at Katie with his large eyes that held galaxies of weariness. "Young one, if you can see their pattern, then help us find a way to break it." Katie stepped up to the main console, and her hands moved quickly across the controls as she overlaid different data streams. Hayes stood behind her with one hand on his weapon because, even though he trusted Katie, he also knew they were in desperate circumstances, and desperate circumstances made people do unpredictable things. "There," Katie said, and she highlighted a section of the Kreshnak formation. "Every 47 seconds when they cycle their weapons, there's a 3-second window where the pattern weakens. If you hit these 3 ships at exactly the same moment during that window, you can disrupt the entire formation." "That's impossible targeting," Park said. "We'd need perfect coordination between 3 different vessels, and our communications are being jammed." "Men use human ships," Katie replied. The command center went quiet. Humanity had only been part of the Allied territories for 18 years, and most species still viewed them as newcomers competent enough as support personnel but not suited for critical combat operations. Earth was considered a backwater world, and its people were seen as having potential, but lacking the centuries of military tradition that other species possessed. "We only have 5 human vessels in the defense fleet," Hayes said carefully, "and 2 of them are damaged. But humans have something the other species don't," Katie said, and she looked at Hayes with eyes that seemed older than her 12 years. "You can improvise." Vorik's scales shifted through several colors as he processed this information. "Captain Hayes, can your people make this shot?" he asked. Hayes pulled up the tactical data and studied the narrow window that Katie had identified. The 3 target ships were positioned in a triangular formation, and hitting all 3 simultaneously would require split-second timing and perfect accuracy under intense enemy fire. It was the kind of shot that had a 5% success rate under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. "We can try," Hayes said, because that was what humans did when faced with impossible odds. They tried anyway. "Lieutenant Park, establish a secure channel to the human vessels," Vorik ordered. "Prepare for coordinated strike on my command." Katie watched the countdown she had calculated in her head. 4 minutes until the pattern completed. The human ships moved into position, and Katie could see them on the tactical display as 3 small dots against an overwhelming enemy force. The vessels were commanded by Captain Lisa Chun on the destroyer Armstrong, Lieutenant Marcus Blake on the frigate Constitution, and Commander Amy Rodriguez on the corvette Valiant. All 3 were experienced officers, but none of them had ever attempted a coordinated strike of this precision during active combat. "All ships report ready," Park announced. 47 seconds until the window opens," Katie said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. Everyone in the command center watched the countdown. The Kreshnak continued their assault, and another Allied cruiser exploded in a brilliant flash of light. 30 seconds. Hayes moved to stand beside Katie, and he put a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, you did everything you could," he said quietly. 20 seconds. The 3 human ships adjusted their positions and their targeting computers, locked onto the Kreshnak vessels. 10 seconds. Katie held her breath. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. The 3 human ships discharged their main weapons. Simultaneously, and the energy beams crossed the void in perfect synchronization. All 3 shots hit their targets at exactly the same instant. The Kreshnak ships exploded and the resonance pattern shattered like breaking glass. The shockwave rippled through the enemy formation, and a dozen Kreshnak vessels went dark as their systems overloaded from the feedback. Cheers erupted in the command center, but Katie wasn't celebrating because she could still see the pattern and something was wrong. "It's not enough," she said, and her voice cut through the jubilation. The celebration died as quickly as it had started. "What do you mean?" Vorik asked. Katie pointed at the display where the Kreshnak ships were already adjusting their positions. "They're adapting. The pattern is reforming, but it's different now and stronger," she said. "We only delayed them by maybe 3 minutes," Hayes swore under his breath. "Then we hit them again," Park said. "It won't work twice," Katie replied. "They've changed the pattern to eliminate that weakness, and I can't find another opening. Not with the time we have left." The command center fell into grim silence. "How long until they complete the new pattern?" Vorik asked. Katie studied the display and calculated the movements in her head. 8 minutes, she said. Maybe 9. "And what happens when they complete it?" Hayes asked, even though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Katie's young face was pale, but her voice was clear. "I think it's a weapon that doesn't destroy ships," she said slowly as understanding dawned. "I think it destroys the will to fight." She turned to look at Commander Vorik, and the Zentari warrior understood what she meant. The Kreshnak weren't building a conventional weapon. They were building something that would break their enemies' spirits before breaking their bodies. "A psychological weapon," Vorik whispered, "aimed at the one thing that keeps defenders fighting when all hope is lost," Katie said. "Fear," Hayes finished. The alarm systems wailed as the stations' shields dropped to critical levels, and Katie Morrison stood in a command center full of officers from a dozen different species and realized that understanding the pattern wasn't enough. They needed to do something that the Kreshnak would never expect. Something that would turn the weapon against its creators. But what? Katie Morrison's mind raced through the pattern again, and this time, she wasn't looking at ship positions or weapon cycles. She was looking at intent. "They want you to be afraid," she said, and everyone in the command center turned to look at her. Commander Vorik's scales had turned a deep shade of gray that indicated confusion mixed with exhaustion. "All weapons inspire fear," he said. "That's the nature of war." "No, you don't understand." Katie insisted, and she pulled up a holographic model of the resonance pattern. "This weapon doesn't just make you afraid. It feeds on fear and amplifies it until you can't think or fight anymore." Lieutenant Park moved closer to examine the data. "The energy readings support that theory," he said. "The resonance isn't targeted at shields or hulls. It's calibrated to biological neural frequencies." Captain Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying they're broadcasting fear directly into our brains?" "Into everyone's brains," Katie corrected. "Every species in the Allied territories has a fear response hardwired into their biology. It's how evolution kept them alive long enough to develop space travel." She highlighted different sections of the pattern. "The Kreshnak studied all of you," she continued. "They know exactly which frequencies trigger panic in Zentari nervous systems, which wavelengths cause Tovathi to freeze in terror, which harmonics make." The Legion warriors abandoned their posts. Vorik sat down heavily in his command chair. In 300 years of defending the Allied territories, his species had faced plasma, cannons and antimatter missiles and biological weapons that could dissolve flesh in seconds. But a weapon that could make warriors forget their training and courage. That was something new and terrifying. "If what you're saying is true, then when that pattern completes, we'll all become useless," he said. "Not all of you," Katie said quietly. Every eye in the command center focused on her. "Humans," Hayes breathed. Katie nodded. "My mom's research was about how humans adapted to space environments differently than other species. she explained. She found something interesting about how our brains process fear. She pulled up files from her mother's research, files she had memorized after her parents died, because they were all she had left of them. Most species evolved on worlds that were relatively stable, Katie said. Their planets had predictable weather and ecosystems, where the biggest threats came from predators that could be avoided or fought. And Earth? Park asked. Earth tried to kill humans every single day, Katie replied. Hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes and ice ages, my mom called. Earth a death world because it was constantly testing whether humans deserved to survive. She brought up comparative data showing survival rates across different planets. Humans developed something unique, she continued. The ability to be absolutely terrified and still function. To feel fear screaming through every nerve and still make rational decisions. Because if ancient humans froze every time they were scared, they would have died out millions of years ago. Hayes said as understanding dawned. Exactly, Katie confirmed. Fear for humans isn't a stop signal. It's a warning light, and we learn to keep driving, even when the warning lights are flashing. Commander Vorik stood up, and his scale shifted to bright orange. The Zentari color for hope mixed with uncertainty. So human personnel might be immune to the Kreshnak weapon? He asked. Not immune, Katie said. They'll feel the fear just as strongly as everyone else. Maybe even stronger because human fear responses are really intense, but they can choose to act anyway. An officer at the environmental station suddenly clutched his head and stumbled backward. It's starting, he gasped. I can feel. Something's wrong. We need to evacuate. We need to... Park caught the officer before he fell. The pattern is at 70% completion, another officer reported, and her voice was shaking. All personnel are beginning to show signs of psychological distress. Katie watched as more and more officers in the command center started to panic. A Velesian warrior who had fought in 20 battles began crying uncontrollably. A Torvathi tactical officer abandoned her post and ran for the exit. Even Commander Vorik's hands were trembling as he tried to maintain control. Captain Hayes, Vorik said, and his voice was strained. How many human personnel do we have on this station? Hayes pulled up the roster. 23 including myself and Lieutenant Park, he said. 23 humans against an enemy fleet, Vorik said, and it would have sounded hopeless, if not for the fact that they had no other options. Katie looked at the tactical display and saw what needed to be done. The core ship, she said, and pointed to the largest Kreshnak vessel at the center of the formation. That's where they're coordinating the resonance from. If you destroy it, the whole pattern collapses. That ship is surrounded by 40 Kreshnak cruisers, Park said. Getting to it would require flying through the most heavily defended position in their entire fleet. Then that's what we do. Hayes said, and his voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted that he might die. Katie grabbed his arm. I'm coming with you, she said. Absolutely not, Hayes replied immediately. You need me, Katie insisted. The Kreshnak formation is constantly shifting, and you'll never navigate through it. Without someone who can see the patterns, without me, you'll fly straight into their guns and die for nothing. Hayes looked at her and saw his best friend's daughter, a 12-year-old girl who should be safe on Earth, going to school and playing with friends. But he also saw someone who had already lost everything to the Kreshnak, and who understood patterns better than any tactical computer. Katie, he began. My parents died fighting them, she said, and her voice was fierce. Don't make their sacrifice meaningless by leaving me behind when I can actually help. Commander Vorik was struggling to focus as the psychological weapons effects grew stronger. Captain Hayes, take whoever you need and launch immediately, he ordered. The rest of us will try to. His voice trailed off as another wave of fear washed through the station. Hayes made a decision that went against every protective instinct he had. Katie, you stay in the shuttle at all times. You navigate, and that's all, he said. The moment things get dangerous, I'm sending you back here. Understood? Katie nodded, even though she had no intention of leaving once they were out there. Lieutenant Park, assemble a strike team, Hayes ordered. I need our 5 best human pilots and anyone who can handle explosives. Park was already moving. Sergeant Nicole Bryant, Corporal Kevin Walsh, Private Amanda Cooper, Specialist Jason Torres, and Technician Ryan Foster. He rattled off names. They're our best, and they're all crazy enough to volunteer for this. The team assembled in the hangar bay in less than 4 minutes. Sergeant Bryant was a demolitions expert who had survived 3 previous Kreshnek encounters. Corporal Walsh had logged more combat flight hours than anyone else in the human contingent. Private Cooper was barely 20 years old, but she could shoot a rifle with impossible accuracy. Specialist Torres knew every trick for sabotaging alien technology. Technician Foster could keep systems running with spare parts and determination. And Katie Morrison was a 12-year-old girl who could see patterns that saved lives. They boarded an assault shuttle that had armor plating covering every surface and weapons that would barely scratch a Kreshnak cruiser. This is insane, Walsh said as he took the pilot's seat. That's why it might work, Bryant replied, and she checked her explosive charges. Hayes stood at the shuttle's tactical station and looked at his team. They were 7 humans about to fly into the heart of an enemy fleet that had destroyed dozens of Allied warships. The psychological weapon was reaching full power, and everyone on the station, except humans, was paralyzed with terror. Listen up, Hayes said. In about 60 seconds, we're going to feel fear like nothing we've ever experienced. And, I mean all of us, including Katie. He looked each person in the eye. That fear is real, and it's going to tell you to run, to hide, to give up. He continued. But here's what I need you to remember. Fear is just information. It tells you that something is dangerous. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. And what are we going to do about it, Captain? Cooper asked. Hayes smiled grimly. We're going to fly straight through it. The shuttle launched from the Vareth Defense Station, and immediately Corporal Walsh had to throw the vessel into a hard dive to avoid incoming fire from 3 Kreshnak destroyers. Katie stood at the navigation console with her hands gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles turned white and her eyes tracked the enemy ship movements. 30 degrees port now, she called out. Walsh obeyed without hesitation, and the shuttle barrel rolled as a plasma beam seared through the space where they had been seconds before. Captain Hayes watched the tactical display and saw their small shuttle as a tiny green dot surrounded by an ocean of hostile red. The assault shuttle had been designed to carry troops into combat zones, not to penetrate the defensive screen of a capital ship formation. They were flying a transport into a meat grinder and hoping courage would be enough. Pattern shift. They're adapting to our vector, Katie announced. Climb 45 degrees and accelerate. The shuttle's engine screamed as Walsh pushed them to maximum thrust. Then the psychological weapon hit them at full force. Hayes felt it first as a cold sensation in his chest that spread through his entire body like ice water in his veins. Pure primal terror flooded his nervous system, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to turn the shuttle around and flee. His heart hammered against his ribs and his hands shook, and his vision tunneled. Behind him, Sergeant Bryant gasped and clutched the wall. Technician Foster dropped to his knees. Private Cooper's rifle clattered to the floor. Even Corporal Walsh, who had flown through antimatter bombardments without flinching, made a sound like a wounded animal. Katie felt it too, and the sensation was like falling through darkness that had no bottom. Her mother was dead. Her father was dead. She was going to die too, and it would hurt, and she would die alone in the cold, black void of space. The fear was so overwhelming that her vision blurred, and she couldn't breathe. Katie, coordinates. Hayes managed to force the words through clenched teeth. She couldn't speak. Couldn't think. The pattern. She needed to see the pattern, but all she could see was her parents' faces when she had identified their bodies. "Katie!" Hayes shouted, and his voice cut through her panic. She blinked and tears streamed down her face, but she forced herself to look at the navigation display. Numbers and vectors swam in her vision. The Kreshnak ships were moving, always moving, and the pattern was there if she could just focus. "Roll starboard," she whispered, and then louder. "Roll starboard 15 degrees and dive." Walsh obeyed, and his hands shook on the controls, but he flew the maneuver perfectly. They passed between two Kreshnak cruisers with less than 50 meters of clearance on either side. "Why are we doing this?" Foster gasped from where he knelt on the floor. "We should go back. We can't win. This is suicide. Because someone has to," Hayes said, and his voice was raw with the effort of speaking while drowning in fear. "That's not a reason," Foster shouted. "It's the only reason that matters," Bryant said, and she pulled herself to her feet, even though her entire body trembled. Cooper picked up her rifle with shaking hands. Torres moved to his station and started preparing the sabotage equipment. They were all terrified, absolutely paralyzed with fear, and they kept working anyway. Katie called out another course correction and Walsh flew it. The shuttle weaved through the Kreshnak formation like a needle threading through fabric, and every second they expected to die. A plasma blast struck their starboard shield, and the shuttle lurched. "Shields at 40%, Walsh reported. 23 more ships between us and the core vessel," Katie said, and her voice cracked. "I can see the path, but there's no margin for error." "Then we don't make errors," Hayes said. Another Kreshnak cruiser fired on them, and this time Walsh was a half-second too slow. The blast tore through the shuttle's porthole, and explosive decompression sucked Specialist Torres toward the breach. Foster lunged and grabbed Torres's leg. Bryant sealed the breach with emergency foam. Torres was screaming, but he was alive. "Hull integrity at 60%, Walsh announced. They had penetrated deeper into the Kreshnak formation than any Allied vessel had managed during the entire battle. The psychological weapon was so intense now that Katie could barely form coherent thoughts. Every instinct demanded that she curl into a ball and hide. Her body wanted to shut down, to escape into unconsciousness rather than face this overwhelming terror. But there was a choice, a tiny space between the fear and her actions. Her parents had studied human adaptation, and they had found that humans could choose, even when choosing felt impossible. "Hard port 90 degrees, Katie called out. "Cut engines for 3 seconds, then full burn forward. That'll put us directly in front of their main gun," Walsh protested. "I know," Katie said, "but it's the only path through." Walsh looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at Katie's tear-streaked face and saw absolute certainty despite the terror in her eyes. "Do it," Hayes ordered. Walsh cut the engines and the shuttle went silent, except for the sound of 7 people breathing hard as they coasted through space. The Kreshnak core ship's main weapon locked onto them. Katie counted in her head. 1, 2, 3, now. She screamed. Walsh fired the engines at full power and the shuttle leaped forward. The Kreshnak weapon discharged and the massive energy beam passed through the space where they would have been if they had maintained their previous vector. They were through the outer defensive screen. "The core ship is 200 meters ahead," Katie said. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of any cruiser they had passed, and its hull was covered with the stringed resonance emitters that projected the psychological weapon. "Weapons are locked on us," Walsh warned. "Get us to their port docking bay," Hayes ordered. "Bryant, are the charges ready?" "Ready, Captain," Bryant confirmed, even though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the detonator. The shuttle dove toward the Kreshnak core ship, and incoming fire hammered their shields. "Shields failing," Walsh announced. A blast struck their engines, and the shuttle started to spin. Walsh fought the controls and managed to crash land inside the Kreshnak docking bay with enough force that everyone was thrown against their restraints. Alarms blared and Katie's head rang from the impact. "Everyone out," Hayes ordered. They stumbled from the shuttle into an alien environment that reeked of ozone and chemicals. The docking bay was enormous, and Kreshnak soldiers were already responding to the intrusion. "Cooper Torres, hold this position," Hayes commanded. "Bryant, Foster, Katie, with me." They ran through corridors that pulsed with the sickening resonance of the psychological weapon. Katie's legs felt like they were made of lead. Every step was a battle against her own nervous system that screamed at her to stop. Bryant planted explosive charges on support structures as they passed. Foster hacked alien terminals to find the resonance generator. Hayes led them deeper into the ship with his weapon ready. There. Katie pointed at a massive chamber where energy flowed between crystalline structures in complex patterns. The resonance generator. It was beautiful and terrible. A weapon designed to break the strongest warriors without firing a single shot. Bryant set the main charge at the base of the central crystal. A Kreshnak commander entered the chamber, a massive creature with 4 arms and scales that shimmered like oil on water. He looked at them with eyes that showed confusion. "You should not be able to move," the Kreshnak commander said in perfect English. "The resonance weapon breaks all who face it. How are you standing?" Hayes stepped forward with his weapon aimed at the alien. "Because humans learned a long time ago that bravery isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's the choice to act despite fear." The Kreshnak commander's eyes widened. "Destroying the generator will create a feedback loop," he said. "Everyone on this shuttle will die." Katie looked at the explosive charges and then at the alien commander. She saw something in his expression. Not fear, but surprise. "You're lying," she said. The Kreshnak commander's scales rippled. "How did you?" "Because if the feedback would only kill us, then you wouldn't care," Katie interrupted. "But you're worried, which means the feedback will destroy your entire fleet." The alien's silence confirmed her deduction. Hayes looked at Bryant. "Arm it," he ordered. Bryant set the timer for 90 seconds. "We need to leave now." Foster shouted. They ran. Katie Morrison ran faster than she had ever run in her life, and behind her, the explosive charges ticked down toward detonation. Captain Hayes and Sergeant Bryant were ahead pulling technician, Foster, who had twisted his ankle in their desperate flight through the Kreshnak core ship. The psychological weapon still screamed through Katie's nervous system, and every muscle in her body wanted to collapse. But she kept moving, because that was what humans did. They reached the docking bay, where Private Cooper and Specialist Torres had held off a dozen Kreshnak soldiers. "Get to the shuttle," Hayes shouted. Corporal Walsh already had the damaged engines powered up and smoking. "This thing won't fly for more than 2 minutes," Walsh warned, as everyone scrambled aboard. "Then we have 2 minutes," Hayes replied. The shuttle lifted off with metal grinding and sparks flying from the compromised engine housing. Katie strapped into the navigation console and pulled up the tactical display with hands that would not stop shaking. 45 seconds until detonation," Brian announced. The Kreshnak fleet had detected their escape, and every ship in the formation turned their weapons toward the small shuttle. "I need the fastest path out of this formation," Walsh said desperately. Katie looked at the patterns and saw death in every direction. The Kreshnak had closed ranks, and there was no safe path through their defensive screen. "Unless fly directly at the core ship," Katie said. "That's the opposite direction from safety," Walsh protested. "Trust me," Katie said, and her voice was steady despite the terror that still flooded her system. Walsh gritted his teeth and aimed the shuttle back toward the massive core vessel they had just escaped from. 30 seconds to detonation. The Kreshnak ships were converging on them, and plasma fire lit up space in every direction. Their shields were gone, and direct hits started punching holes through the hull. 20 seconds. Katie watched the pattern and waited for the exact moment when the Kreshnak formation would shift to prevent them from escaping toward the station. 15 seconds. The enemy fleet moved exactly as she predicted, tightening their formation on one side while leaving the opposite vector exposed. Now, full turn 180 degrees and maximum burn. Katie shouted. Walsh spun the shuttle and fired the engines so hard that warning alarms filled the cabin. They shot through the gap Katie had identified just as the Kreshnak realized their mistake. 10 seconds. The shuttle was racing away from the core ship at maximum velocity. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but its effects were immediate and catastrophic. The resonance generator detonated, and the feedback loop Katie had predicted tore through the crystalline structures. Energy that had been carefully controlled to project fear suddenly became wild and chaotic. The core ship's hull buckled and split apart as the resonance weapon consumed itself, but the feedback did not stop there. Every Kreshnak vessel in the formation had been linked to the core ship through the resonance pattern. The backwash of psychological energy flooded through those connections like water rushing backward through pipes. For the first time in their species' history, the Kreshnak felt the weapon they had inflicted on others. Pure overwhelming terror crashed through their neural systems. Kreshnak commanders abandoned their posts. Soldiers fled from their stations. Ship captains issued contradictory orders in voices thick with panic. The entire fleet descended into chaos as the beings who had weaponized fear discovered what it felt like to drown in it. Katie watched the tactical display as red hostile markers scattered in every direction. Kreshnak ships collided with each other in their desperate flight. Some jumped to faster than light speed without calculating safe vectors and disappeared into unknown regions of space. Others simply went dark as their crews became incapable of operating their vessels. On the Vareth defense station, Commander Vorik felt the pressure of the psychological weapon suddenly vanish. His scales shifted from gray to vibrant blue, the Xanthari color of relief and joy. Officers throughout the command center straightened up as their minds cleared. What happened? Vorik asked. Lieutenant Park pulled up sensor data, and his mouth fell open. The Kreshnak fleet is retreating, he said in disbelief. Scratch that. They're not retreating, they're running. Allied forces that had been paralyzed moments before rallied and began pursuing the scattered enemy vessels. But most of the Kreshnak ships were already gone, fled into the depths of space to escape the terror their own weapon had created. The shuttle limped back toward the station with its engines failing and hull breached in a dozen places. Walsh guided them into a crash landing in the hangar bay that destroyed the shuttle's landing gear but kept everyone alive. Emergency crews rushed forward as the team stumbled out. Katie's legs gave out and Captain Hayes caught her. You did it, he said, and his voice was filled with something between wonder and exhaustion. We did it, Katie corrected. Medical teams took Torres and Foster to the infirmary. Cooper and Walsh sat on the hangar deck and laughed with the hysterical relief of people who had faced certain death and somehow survived. Bryant carefully set down her remaining explosive charges and then promptly sat down beside them. Commander Vorik arrived in the hangar bay with a dozen other Allied officers. The Xanthari commander looked at the 7 humans who had just turned an impossible battle into an improbable victory. You flew into the center of an enemy fleet, Vorik said slowly, destroyed their most powerful weapon from the inside, and escaped. It seemed like a good idea at the time, Hayes replied. Vorik's scales rippled with colors that Katie did not recognize, but she thought maybe one of them was respect. The Galactic Council will want a full report, Vorik continued. They will want to understand how 7 humans accomplished what an entire defense fleet could not. Katie looked up at the commander. It's simple, she said. Someone had to do something, and we were the ones who could. Because humans can function while afraid, Vorik said. No, Katie corrected gently. Because humans choose to function while afraid. There's a difference. The Xanthari commander nodded slowly. Over the next hours, as Allied forces secured the station and treated the wounded, the full scope of the victory became clear. The Kreshnak had lost 37 ships in the battle. More importantly, they had lost their psychological advantage. News of the defeat spread through the Kreshnak Empire, and for the first time their enemies understood that the fearsome warriors could be beaten. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss the battle. Representatives from 40 species wanted to know about the humans who had changed everything. But Katie Morrison was not in those meetings. She walked through the station's memorial hall where names were inscribed on crystalline walls. Each name represented someone who had died defending the Allied territories. Her parents' names were there near the bottom of one wall. Dr. Margaret Morrison and engineer Paul Morrison, killed defending Research Outpost Varath 3. Katie placed her hand on their names. "I hope I made you proud," she whispered. "They would be," Captain Hayes said from behind her. He came to stand beside her and looked at the names of people he had served with. "Commander Vorik says the council wants to give you a medal," Hayes continued. Katie made a face. "I don't want a medal," she said. "I just wanted to stop the Kreshnak from killing anyone else." "I know," Hayes replied. "But you did more than that. You showed the entire galaxy that humanity has something special. The ability to see patterns." Katie asked. "The ability to choose courage when everything tells you to choose safety," Hayes said. They stood together in the memorial hall, and outside the viewport, Allied ships moved through space, repairing damage and recovering survivors. The battle was over. The Kreshnak were scattered. And one 12-year-old girl had raised her hand when everyone else was paralyzed by fear. "What happens now?" Katie asked. Hayes smiled. "Now the galaxy learns a lesson they should have known already," he said. "Never underestimate the species from Earth, and never underestimate someone just because they're young." Katie added, "That too." Hayes agreed. Katie looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Kreshnak were regrouping and planning their next move. Somewhere out there, other threats waited in the darkness between worlds. But Katie Morrison had learned something important during the battle. Fear was real and valid and sometimes overwhelming, but so was choice. And choosing to act, to raise your hand when no one else could. That was the thing that changed everything. Not weapons or technology or superior numbers. Just one person deciding that doing something was better than doing nothing. Even when doing something seemed impossible. Especially when doing something seemed impossible. Commander Vorik found them an hour later. "The council wants to meet you," he said to Katie. "They have many questions about human capabilities." Katie looked at Hayes, and he nodded encouragingly. "Okay," she said. "But I'm not special. Any human could have done what I did." That, Vorik said with his scale shifting to a color Katie had learned meant profound respect. "Is precisely what terrifies and amazes us about your species." They walked together toward the council chambers, and Katie Morrison, who had lost her parents and her home but had kept her courage, prepared to help the galaxy understand that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their weapons. It was their choice, the choice to stand up when standing seemed impossible, the choice to fight when fighting seemed futile,